And apparently I'm... Okay, I think it's recording, but Laura, I would really appreciate if you could try and record as well, just in case, since I got an error message the first time I made the attempt. All right. So, a little intro. What do we mean by data structure? You might also see this referred to as data model. If I flip between saying data model and data structure, I'm really talking about the same thing. So hopefully that won't confuse anyone if I do end up flipping back and forth between saying data model and data structure. When we're discussing the data structure or the data model, we are trying to make decisions about the type of information that we want to keep and how we want to organize that information. For the session that we're covering today and for the one that we recently did on the volunteer software, we're talking about the actual records that we keep in our database. So not any of the setup or related information, but specifically, in this case, our organization, program, subject, etc. records. So the main records that you enter into your database. That is the model that we're discussing today. When we talk about how information is stored and organized, we have to think about how we're going to use it, because that implies something about the information we need to keep and how we're going to structure it. So these are some of the questions that we need to ask. First, who will be accessing the information and what are their needs? That can be the public, it can be a third-party client, it can be your INR staff, it can be your data managers. All of those different types of users need to be assessed individually for what kind of information they need and how it is that they are going to use that information. Question number 2 is a follow-on from that. What kind of information is needed for referral purposes? In other words, what do you need in order to actually get value out of the record in terms of the basic information about the program, services, etc. And what information do staff need for the data management process? So that's supplementary information that is needed in order to properly maintain the record. So it isn't about the service per se, it's about the record. So we're distinguishing between what information you might give out over the phone or what information is provided by that organization about their organization, program, service, etc., versus what information that the data managers require to understand what kind of quality the record is, when it was updated, when it needs to be updated again, past history of changes, all those kinds of management information. That would also include things like internal memo or your editor's memo, anything that's really about the maintenance of the record and not information that's directly provided by the organization or service provider and not used for the purposes of INR. Okay? Next question. What kind of historical information do we need to understand the changes to the record over time? We have a history system built in now, which does tell us quite a lot of detail about how a particular field changes from one revision to another. So if I'm editing the description and I add a new sentence, those history tools allow me to see, what was changed, the fact that I added the sentence, when I added it, and who added it. That's just one kind of historical piece of information. The usage of the record over the past provides us with some historical information about the record. And also, when we look at some kinds of record information, for example, let's take capacity information, like a license capacity, or for those that do track, say, a vacancy information, sometimes you need more information about the changes rather than just the display if you actually want to do statistical tracking of capacity over time, let's say. So you have to understand, not just for the record as a whole, but for the individual parts of the record, what do you need to understand about how that record changes over time? Next question. What type of searches do we want to be able to perform? This has a very significant impact on how we store information in the database. So let's take languages as an example. You could store languages as a simple paragraph of text where you could really type in anything that you wanted. And certainly that is how the languages field once upon a time was kept. However, if you want to do certain kinds of searching, you need to add a greater structure to that information. And the same is true of if we take the area served field. Certainly you could just type out the service area in a paragraph format, but in doing so, you make it impossible to perform a search based on that information because you haven't entered it in a format where the software can make decisions about the information. Because if it's simple text that someone types out, it's not structured enough for the software to make decisions about searching and sorting the information. So understanding how we want to locate information is a really critical component to organizing that information. Another example would be minimum and maximum ages. If you simply type the minimum and maximum ages into a free text field for eligibility, you take away the ability to search by age. And finally, what type of statistics do we want to be able to gather? In the volunteer session, I talked a lot about how you could take components of the records and gather certain kinds of statistical information to do to get a hint about how these services play out in the community. For instance, if all your postings happen to be in very particular communities, that tells you something about the profile of these services across your community. And likewise, if we take something like the taxonomy and we determine that there are a certain proportion of services that fall under a particular branch of the taxonomy as a percentage of all of the services in the database, it tells you something about how that particular kind of need is met in the community. If you have a very small number of those services or a very large number of those services, it gives you some information about what you have. The same can be true for areas served. If you look at how many services you have in one community versus how many services you have in another, you can gather some really interesting statistical information. But again, just like with searching, in order to gather those kinds of statistics, the information has to be organized in a way in which you can analyze and then report on that information. So the first step is to decide what kind of reporting you want to do, and that then informs how you would structure the information in order to be able to produce those kinds of reports. Does anyone have any questions on those questions or those kinds of thoughts that we need to consider when we're evaluating the data structure? Anything that you'd like to add to that list? Okay. So I'm going to move on then, and we're going to talk a little bit about how our data structure, our data model is influenced by standards groups and information standards that we have. So a large part of CIOC's current data structure for community information records has been modeled on historical and current Inform Ontario standards. And I say modeled on and not is exactly, because I think everyone knows that it's an evolving process. So both the standards change over time, and as does CIOC's data model or data structure change over time. So they're not always entirely in sync. And also, CIOC's data model goes quite a bit beyond what the official data models or data structure standards are. So all of the, I guess, mandatory fields that might be listed as part of the Inform Ontario standards, that only represents actually a relatively small proportion of the total number of fields that are available in CIOC. So it influences it, and it influences a portion of it, but it's certainly not true that CIOC's data structure is entirely modeled after Inform Ontario standards or vice versa. So that's the context that we need to understand. And beyond the standards group, and in particular Inform Ontario standards, which is the main thing that informs our model now in terms of external influences, CIOC has to reflect all the individual requirements of its members. And not everyone is in Ontario, first of all, but even among those in Ontario, they don't all fall under the purview of Inform Ontario, or they may loosely use Inform Ontario standards, but also have additional requirements or different requirements from what Inform Ontario has. So we have to understand that not all members are working to the same set of standards or have the same needs or requirements around the data that they keep. So in whatever model we come up with, there has to still be room for flexibility in the type of information people are keeping, because we have to respect that not all of our members come from the same place or provide the same types of services to the same people. So we'll never have, everybody uses exactly the same field. In fact, I doubt you would find any two members that use exactly the same fields in exactly the same way across all of our entire membership. I would be shocked if you found exact compliance between even two members. Okay. And my last little statement on standards, I think, is a really important one. That CIOC has made a commitment in this project to keep existing functionality during the development work for the project. And really beyond that as well, CIOC has a commitment to its members to preserve their ability to do their work. And so changes to data models always have to be considered very carefully and always cause some degree of discomfort for members when we make a change to our data model. So it has to be done very carefully. And in particular, CIOC simply doesn't have the option of just coming in and making a decision to take away any kind of display or searching functionality of a data element if some of our members need it to remain the way it is. That just isn't an option. So we can't say, oh, we don't feel like supporting this field anymore. I'm sorry if you're using it, but we've decided that we don't want it in the database anymore. Too bad for you. That just isn't an option. And likewise, if we make significant functionality changes that prevent people from doing their work in the same way or in an effective way, that really isn't an option. So we have to be very careful in making sure that as much as we want to try and work to standards, we respect the way that all of our members are doing their work and the fact that we can't take away functionality that they already have without their consent. Okay. In particular, we know that this is a contentious issue with a few specific fields that have come up again and again over the years. I'll highlight them here, but they require a lot of discussion, I think. Eligibility being one, in particular the minimum and maximum ages, the area served field, and how those predefined communities are used versus what is displayed, and likewise how the located in community field works and what kind of information should be kept in it. So we're aware of those things, and certainly if everyone agreed that it should all work this way, then it would be a no-brainer to make changes to these fields. But because we know that there are significant disagreements about whether things should continue to work the way they are, if they should be drastically changed, or whether we have to come up with some kind of compromise position, that says that we have to have a discussion, and we do have to come up with a compromise position and potentially have the ability for individual members to make their own choices about how some of these things work, because we can't, as I say, unilaterally say we're not going to allow it to work that way anymore for you, even though you need it to work that way because someone else wants it to work a different way. So any questions about that? I figure that's going to come up in a bit of discussion at the end. But all right, so what kind of changes are we considering? So we need to first think about what we're keeping now. What kind of information are we keeping now? Does the current set of fields and the way that they're structured meet the current needs of clients and staff? Is it organized effectively for searching statistics, data entry, all of those various uses that we need? And that comes back to the list of questions that I had on that first slide. And it's always worth finding out if we have any fields that aren't being used, although I doubt it. I thought, oh, we must have almost no one using the DD code field anymore. And then I did a little search, and yep, people are still using the DD code field as a DD code field. So even fields that we think are not really being used or useful anymore, we really have to confirm whether or not that's the case. If a field really isn't being used and really isn't useful anymore, it actually should be removed from the software because there is a maintenance burden in keeping especially complex fields, so fields with multiple different parts and components, up to date. So it's not, oh, it's already there, let's just leave it there. It really does impact our ongoing maintenance of the software, every single thing that we add into it. So it's never a good idea to leave things in the software if they're truly no longer useful. The smaller and more compact and simplified the software can be, the cheaper it is to maintain, the easier it is to maintain. So it is always worth doing an assessment of what are people actually using and what are they not using. And if we find that there is a part of a field or a whole field or a whole class of information that really is not being used effectively anymore, people don't want it or need it, likely it should be considered for removal. So I'm going to list a few of the changes that we're already aware of in terms of what people are talking about changing to our existing fields, and then on the next slide I'm going to talk about some potential new data elements, and then we'll open up discussion. The first is something we've talked about recently, which is changing all our other memo fields into the same format as the new internal memo field. Because this is so new, and because it is quite a drastic change to how the memo fields work, we wanted to allow people time to use the internal memo field as is, assess it, tell us what works and what doesn't work before we decide that we're going to also have this format for the comments field and the public comments field and so on. So it certainly isn't our intention that all three types of memo field will be the same over time, but we want to make sure that we've done the right thing with the existing internal memo field before we launch into adding those features to the other fields. We know that we really need to start bringing structure into the various phone fields and the hours field. In particular with the phone fields, it's an ongoing issue that the free text format of these fields makes it impossible to pull out an actual phone number. At the same time, we can't just make this a phone number field because usually there's lots of text that goes along with the phone field, information about the phone line. There may be multiple phone lines, each for a different purpose. So it's not a simple matter of, oh, let's make everyone enter it in a simple phone number format and that's our field. We need to respect the way that people keep the information now, knowing that they have labels for the phone numbers. They have many different types of format of phone number. Some of them could even be international phone formats and so on. They have notes about the phone number, and they may have many different numbers in a single, what we would call a single phone field, like the office phone field or even the toll-free field. There may be multiple numbers. For the hours field, again, it's a complex issue because it's not as simple as allowing them to type in the opening and closing days on Monday and the opening and closing days on Tuesday and so on. This is because they may have multiple operating hours for different components of the services that they do. So one particular part of their program might have operating days of Monday and Wednesday, and another part of that program operates Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. And you cannot simply capture that in a single, enter in your hours for Monday, enter in your hours for Tuesday kind of format. And also, within a single day, you might have multiple opening and closing times. They may open in the morning, close for lunch period, and open again in the afternoon. So we have to respect the information that people already keep in any kind of new format that we do. Unfortunately, when you add structure to these types of fields, which everyone will have already noticed from the structured contact fields, you make the forms significantly more complex. What used to be 5 simple fields in the contact field is now quite a large and complex form. So although it has the advantage of the structure, which gives you a lot more control and consistency on the information, you also make the data entry process in a way more complex, because in order to capture all the different variances that can occur, like having different parts of the service have different operating hours, creating a data entry process for that becomes a real challenge. And in the end, there has to be an assessment of, is the benefit gained by structuring this information significant enough that is worth the extra complexity for the data manager who's going to have to work with these complicated forms instead of just being able to type in what it is that they need. So with most of these, it is not a given that we would say, okay, that's it, it must be structured. We really do need to consult with our members and say, this is a trade-off. Is this trade-off beneficial enough to our membership that it's worth doing this work? And then they'll have to assess things, take the hours field, like, well, if I actually properly enter in the hours in a structured format, I can search for what's open right now. So if someone's looking for a medical, an after-hours medical clinic, I can say, check a tick box that says only open right now, or only open now, or only open at, and pick a time or a day. And it would only bring up services that were open at that particular time. That type of search isn't possible without structure behind it. And that comes back to the original list of questions where one of them was, what kinds of searches do we want to be able to perform? And if you decide, having the ability to search for a service that's open at a particular time is an important thing that we would like to be able to do. It would add value to our services. Then that says, well then in order to provide that type of search, we need to do this type of structural change. Okay? It's not a simple, but again, it's not simple because it is a trade-off. So everyone has to be comfortable with what that trade-off means. And it may be that not everyone is, and that may mean that you have you have 2 options for the hours field. You have some people who have the option of entering it in a structured format and therefore gaining access to searches and so on, and that you create a second field that can be used in an alternative way for those who just want to be able to type the hours of operation and not use a very complex form, and understand that that means that they will not have the ability to do any searching or take advantage of that structured format. Okay. Next, and again, please feel free to ask questions in the middle if you have them now, or save them up till I'm done this slide. We've had a few requests to allow people to enter in multiple email addresses in the email field. You can do this now, but only by separating them by a comma, and that's not particularly useful because it doesn't tell you what each of the emails is for. Likewise, you can create a brand new email field, but it has to be for a particular purpose, and again, it doesn't allow you to have an individual label or note about the email to tell you what that particular email is for. So the enhancement here would be to allow you to have multiple email addresses, label each one, saying, this is the email for X, if it needed a label, and also provide some kind of note about the email if necessary. So similar to what we might be talking about for phone fields, where you'd be able to enter multiple phone numbers in a single phone field. We've had a few requests around the ward field as people start using this more. One is that I guess in some areas they don't actually use the word ward, which kind of surprised me. They have other labels for it. And because this is built into the software, we don't give anyone any choice about how the ward field is displayed and what kind of labels are used. And I guess this ends up presenting an issue in some communities because they have another way in which they need to display that information. So we need to find out what the local community needs are in terms of what the ward field needs to be able to store, and also potentially give people some options about how that ward information is actually displayed to the end user. And this one's been hanging around for many years. Adding a method of payment component to the fees field. Again, this would be optional. That's why I have optional in front of it. If you configured it, that you would have a checklist of different types of payment methods that could be used to pay fees at that organization, and apparently that is part of the AIR standard, and that's why that's come up. And at this stage, I'm going to open it up to general discussion. And by general discussion, I do mean general. So any comments about this process, about how we might go about gathering people's opinion or input on these types of changes, if you have any particular recommendations or concerns, pretty much anything you'd like to discuss. So I am going to unmute you. Feel free to remute yourself if there's too much noise where you are. And feel free to use the questions box if you cannot speak because you don't have a working microphone or phone. Okay? Any comments, questions? Yep.
Kate, it's Barb. I'll start. Because you touched on earlier, for example, the eligibility field. Do you have any particular suggestions for how we can resolve some of those issues with the ages?
Yeah, so in my personal opinion, so I guess the issue is really repeating the minimum and max, the question of whether minimum and maximum age should be stored for searching purposes, but then re-entered into the notes of the eligibility, just so people are clear here, but then re-entered into the eligibility notes, and then the minimum and maximum ages wouldn't be displayed. They would only be used for searching. And my opinion is, if you want the minimum and maximum ages to be inserted into the eligibility notes for display, then I'll do that. If you don't like the way it's formatted right now, let's change it. I don't see the reason why you would enter the information twice.
Oh, so it could be as simple as just a reformatting for how it's displayed.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Honestly, I mean, I just think that's a silly one. Because there's no reason. If you don't like the format of it, let's change the format. There's no asking people to enter the information in twice is ridiculous. People are
I
not
vote for that one.
Enter the information twice.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, that's good. Area served was another one.
Yeah, so lots of things come up around the area served that we are well aware of. So we have issues with. And this comes back to the communities table. So you can't talk about areas served without talking about the communities table and some of the deficiencies of it. So there's two particular needs which tend to cause ongoing issues with the way that we work with areas served. One is communities that have multiple different names. So we do allow you to have a display name, but it's not quite the same thing as alternate names. And in particular, this comes up a lot in the north, where there will be traditional Aboriginal names, potentially more than one traditional Aboriginal name for a community, as well as what would be, the English name or the sort of map name of that community, and we don't give any option for people to search using their preferred name. In other words, either you give it a display name, which changes the name for display only in search results, or there's just no equivalent of a use reference. If you think of the communities table as a classification system, which it really is, there's no equivalent of a use reference, or use instead. So, if I want to search community X, it's the same as community Y, right? So, to me, the solution is if you have a community that needs multiple different names, then you build into the communities table the ability to call one community by many different names, and you allow people to use any one of them and to search with any one of those names, so that kind of eliminates that entire issue, and we can make some decisions about how that should be displayed. So whether it would display the official name and then in brackets any alternate names for that community, just so that it was always displayed. And those can all be choices in the setup. So let's say I do have community Y and it has 5 alternate names, and 2 of them I want to show in the display. So if I was viewing the record, it would say community Y, bracket community X, community Z. And the other 3 I would want to work for searching, but I wouldn't want to show in the display. So that's all possible without changing the way that people are doing their work or collecting the information, and without making people enter that information multiple times. If a community truly has multiple names, the answer is not to record them many times in the record. The answer is to record the many names once in the communities table, because then there's no ongoing work for the data manager to remember what all those possible names are. Right? That shouldn't be part of what the data manager has to do, is remember that this particular community goes by 3 other names. Because they can't do that. It's just not realistic to expect that of a data manager. It should be configured once in the communities table, and then be searchable and usable and displayable in all those records, but the data manager only has to be working with one name. And whether the person provides the information using the native name, they could do the data entry using the native name or the English name or whatever. It would all be stored the same way and displayed the way that you had decided. So that, to me, addresses that problem. That's how that particular problem should be addressed.
Okay. Isn't boundaries the other piece of that that's still an issue?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So boundaries comes into, but there's more than that. So
okay.
The other part of the communities table issue, I know is particularly an issue in Toronto, but also could be in other areas. I know for sure it is in Toronto, that they have traditional community boundaries and official community boundaries. Meaning, within the local neighborhoods, they know their neighborhood as X. And those boundaries are not the same as the official boundaries. So the issue is when people are searching for a service, they're going by, their colloquial neighborhood name, which has nothing to do with any of the official community boundaries. So how do you cope with that when it's not one-to-one? Let's say it's the east half of this neighborhood and the west half of this other neighborhood represents this local community name that everyone who lives there knows. Okay? Is that? Yep. I think that should be clear, but if it's not, let me know. So the proposal that I had for that situation is that, again, you need to change the communities table. You need to add an entry. Again, it would be like a use reference, but a use reference where it tells you to use 2 communities. So in the other case, we're talking about alternate names. In this case, we're talking about if I'm looking for community X, I can do the data entry as community X. I can use that colloquial, that local community name if that's truly its service area. So let's say they have a local community group that really serves that pretend community that's on no official It's not official in any way, but everyone who lives in that neighborhood knows it as that and knows what the boundaries are, okay? So I need to be able to do my data entry. I need to be able to display that information using that local community name that everybody knows, right? Because that's the true area that it serves, and that's what people are going to know. But I don't have that unofficial community in my database right now, and I have no way to capture it because it overlaps two different areas and only partially. So the solution then is to allow you to create that pretend community in your database and say, yes, people can do data entry with that community, but when you search, you should search it as if it's this community and have it search those two areas that it overlaps. That's really the best that you can do. So really the advantage here is, again, we're not making people do data entry twice, because in the other proposal, what you would do in that situation is you would have them pick the search communities, and then you would have them do a completely separate data entry for what they actually want to display in the record. Now, for the rare record in which that's going to occur, my issue is, let's say 97% of your records, what you tick for searching is the same as what you want for display. Are you going to make people double enter for 97% of your records so that 3% of your records can display right? That is a really, no, that's backwards. So what you need to do is say, how can we accommodate those special cases, and either allow them to do a special data entry just in those cases, like a special, also include these communities for searching but don't display them. That's one example of how we can handle it. Or you can build right into the communities table saying, let them add this pretend community, which doesn't really exist, it's unofficial, but whenever they add it, what you're really searching for is this and this and this. Okay? And either way you do it is still better than making people do double data entry for 97% of their records.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and there really is a difference. I mean, I don't know if anyone has any commentary on that part before I get into boundaries, which is yet another one. Okay, so I mean, the boundaries issue comes up again because, how do you distinguish between the areas served and the boundaries? Because they're really not the same. And it becomes an issue because you have the areas served notes, which tend to refine within the community that maybe only a portion of that area is served. But whether the boundary should continue to be a separate field, or I disagree with the argument of boundaries tells you that the display of the areas served and areas served is just for searching and should be hidden. I don't particularly agree with that. I think most members wouldn't. I think they're different. But I mean, that's another debate entirely. I would be interested in hearing the arguments of people who want to change or do away with one or the display of one or the other, and then it would be easier to respond to, but it's hard to respond without hearing I think I get some of the reasoning why that's it, but I'm really just against double data entry. I don't want people to have to enter the same information multiple times.
But it probably would be a bad idea.
But that's got to be
possible
to the members, so.
You live within this cap.
Sorry, yeah?
Would it be possible to just do away with all the area served notes and have all the notes in the boundaries field like we used to?
The issue is not everybody uses boundaries.
Ah. If we took away their notes, they would have to.
Well, but then that's an issue because some people want everything to do with the areas captured in one place. And it really, there is a relevance to having the distinction next to that area. And boundaries can give you a more of a, sort of a boundary sense, right? It's about this, less to this, whereas when you're looking at areas served, it's a very direct in your face. I serve this area, this area, this area. It's really a very different way of looking at the information.
Mm-hmm.
So if it said the boundary was, this particular street and anything south of it was included, people actually have to do some thinking of what that means versus areas served. They would clearly see community names and recognize or not recognize those names. And I think boundaries can be important for clarification, but it's not the same way of looking at the issue at all.
I think and this may be because we serve largely a rural area. First of all, for people filling in that kind of information on updating or what have you, they don't see a distinction. The public doesn't see a distinction between areas served and boundaries. And in terms of us asking for that information, there's very few organizations that have such defined boundaries that. Right. Largely, we don't use that boundaries field because it's probably for a very, very, very small, less than 1% of our records that would actually have very formal boundaries for the area they're served. So it hardly seems worthwhile. We tend to use the area served field, and that they understand. Yeah,
and I think that's the case for a lot of members, that the boundaries field is not used with any great depth by most members. It's definitely the areas served field that gets used extensively.
Yeah, it's
people
that
understand
handful of records.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I just said it's that handful of records that have those clearly defined, we won't serve you if you live on the other side of this street kind of programs.
The question is, do we have to have that? Is it necessary for us to keep that information?
I think it's fairly important.
Okay.
But it can be important for those handful of records, but it doesn't mean you have to keep it for the rest.
Yeah,
if you
I
say,
agree.
Oh, yeah.
If you say areas served, if the data in areas served is correct and complete, why fill out boundaries as well, right? It's the double data entry thing that I think all of you keep so much information and do so much work on these records that anything where you don't have to enter what is basically the same information multiple times is a good thing. We're already looking for ways to try and reduce the duplication of effort with classification systems, right? So.
Well, and it's not only that, it's the amount of information we're asking from people when we're doing the updating. They're getting more and more and more impatient. It's like, come on. People have offered their firstborn because they figure that's the next question, seriously. So, the less we let's keep what's absolutely pertinent to do the job, but when we beleaguer them with information that, may be helpful, in a small percentage of the cases, I think we really alienate. I mean, we get people just hanging up because, you just forget it. This is too much, And so I think it's not just a matter of our workload. It's what are we asking of people, and they think we're just going too far. In terms of what we're gathering. So I think we have to weigh carefully what's the importance, how relevant is what we're collecting for the average information that the public's looking for.
Yeah. Yeah, and that comes back, if you don't mind me tying it back, that comes back to when we talk about structuring some of these data elements, about how we hide that complexity from the public. I know I really do know there has been a lot of frustration from people about the fact that the public gets a different data entry form than you do for contact, because it gives you a little extra data management burden in terms of parsing out that information that they provide you. But when you think about the flip side of that, in that you're giving the public a more simple form, something that's easier for them to cope with, that's the kind of thing you're going to continue to have to consider if we put more structure and more complexity into some of these fields, are you going to continue that on into what you give to the public? Because if you give them a hugely complex form for entering their hours of operation, they are going to balk. They are not going to want to fill that form out.
That's right.
Can I just complain about the... Sorry, I just wanted to complain about the way we're keeping contacts now. I find it too complex.
Yeah.
And I understand the reasoning behind it. It's just nuts, in my opinion. It's an example of where we have gone too far.
So your suggestion?
Yeah, and that, I mean, honestly, if that ends up being a huge issue, then the solution to that is to provide different alternate methods for keeping contacts and give people some decision-making power about how they're going to keep the information.
Yeah.
Obviously, then, if you give individuals decision-making power about how they're storing the information, that has implications for how you share it with other people and so on. So it has to be done thoughtfully, but it absolutely is really important, and I liked doing the contacts ahead of time because I think it really gives people a flavor for what making fields more complex can do. And better to have this experience with one field before we talk about doing it to a whole whack of other fields, right? Because it's going to impact your work. It's going to make your forms complicated. And you, the membership as a whole, have to be prepared for the consequences of what that will do. It is a trade-off. You have a benefit, but is the benefit worth the extra complexity and the extra workload that you're going to have as a result? And everyone needs to be comfortable with that.
Makes sense.
So it's nothing we can decide on this phone call, but I think we do need to think about how these decisions are going to be made. It has to be done in the hands of CIOC, so it can't just be pushed down from the standards group, although we want to work with the standards group. We have more members than what the standards group covers. Mm-hmm. So it's important that it really has to be reflective of the entire membership. And in many cases, the changes we make in the community information trickle over to the volunteer because you use the same structures, just like contact. So it really has to be done as a group very thoughtfully, and we have to make sure people are involved because this, more than probably any other kind of change to the software, is going to have a tremendous influence on your day-to-day work. Mm-hmm. Huge influence. And if people aren't involved and then they have to deal with the consequences of it, it's going to be bad news. So we have to have some kind of or we have to think about how we're going to get together the membership and really make these challenging decisions about some of these changes.
Mm-hmm. Kate, another couple of fields that the public finds very confusing is the fees versus funding field.
Yeah.
And we get all sorts of stuff put in those, and I'm wondering if I don't have a solution. I'm not even sure I have the question other than to say that those two fields are another that are confused in the same way that areas served and boundaries are. It's like, well, what's supposed to go in here? What is the information that we're actually after here? Yeah. And because it's clear from the way people fill them in that they really have no clue what we're asking and why. You know? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So part of that is, I think we really have not done a good job of providing good help to the public about these fields. We don't have any kind of standardized help system to provide people good information about what is expected in each of the fields. And it has to be, right now there's one set of field help for staff and the public, and if you write it for staff, it's over the heads of the public. Mm-hmm. And if you write it for the public, then it doesn't contain enough detail for staff. who have to understand the data standards and all of that. So
Right.
that, in part, gets addressed by our acknowledging that we need to better the help for each of these fields to give both staff and the public better instructions about how to use the information. And if the public doesn't clue in to the fact that there is help available, we need to figure out how to better design their forms so that they can easily see the help. So, and there are nice little tricks that we can do in terms of the user interface to make it more clear to them what each particular thing is for. But other than that, it's, you know, some things like funding, that I think is an optional data element. So individually, the members have to decide, I don't have to keep this. Is it benefiting people to keep this information? Is it benefiting me? And what am I getting out of it? Is it benefiting the people who are the consumers of the information? Are they actually making use of that funding information? Am I getting statistics about it? You know, do I really want to keep it? And that could be said for a lot of the fields. I think sometimes people get so used to collecting a particular kind of information that they don't step back and say, what am I actually doing with this information? Benefiting me? Who's using it? So, you know, that can be part of the process too.
I think those fields are areas where people really feel that we step into more confidential areas, especially in terms of funding. It's like, what on earth do you need to know that for? You know, like they really don't understand. They feel that that's just going way too far in terms of information gathered. And, you know, I can't really justify for them because I've never had to give that information to anybody. So it's why am I really collecting it?
Absolutely. So that's a good question to ask yourself. Why are you collecting it? And if nobody needs it and nobody's using it, maybe you shouldn't be collecting it. Maybe you should give yourself a break.
Isn't it an air standard?
Yeah, it is.
Is it?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's a required field. Yeah.
I didn't think it was it's not a required field for 2-in-1 Ontario then, I guess. There's somewhere where I thought it wasn't required.
Well, then they took it out.
Is it? I knew.
Because it's the IO standard.
Is it? Oh, okay.
It's an air standard.
Air standard, yeah.
But again, why are we using it?
Yeah.
We're never giving that information out.
Yeah. See, I used to get asked all the time for how many agencies are funded by X ministry. You know.
By the public?
By the public, yeah. Public, mostly agencies, but other agencies or other ministries. But yeah, by the public, I've had them say, well, who funds those guys?
Yeah, I've had that question too.
Yeah.
Now, I see in the style guide fees as a mandatory field, but not funding.
Yeah, that's what I had thought. That it wasn't listed.
Oh, okay. I was sure funding was there. Okay, I'll go back and look.
I don't see it there.
Funding. Yeah, is that the one? Oh, maybe I'm thinking it's another field. Service level. There's one that where the United Way code is mandatory. What field's that?
The United Way, I think, would be service level, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
The United Way agency?
Yes.
Is that where it is? That stupid service level? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. So
Legal
maybe
status
funding
is
that.
housing.
Legal status. That's the one. That's the one. Yeah. Okay. So funding isn't. Okay.
No.
So anyway, it comes down to a few things. One is, again, assessing the information you're keeping, and if you really are getting to the point of keeping too much information that overwhelms you, it overwhelms the agency, and you're not really sure what you're using it for, that means take a step back, figure out if you actually need to keep it all. We know we need to improve the help for the public. We need to make sure that they understand what each of them are for. Some of that is improving some of the forms. So for instance, if the funding checkboxes were on the feedback form and all they had to do was check a box, they wouldn't be so confused.
That's
right?
true. Right.
So to some degree, as we make other kinds of improvements to the software that we know we want to make, like putting those checkboxes on the feedback forms, you're going to get less complaints because they're not going to have to type out all the languages. They can just tick off the ones they use. They're not going to have to figure out what funding means. They're just going to have to check a box. I'm funded by, you know, regional funding. Tick. Done. So that kind of change may help you in collecting the information. It may make it easier for the public to understand what's going on.
I think the other thing, and Leslie, I'm actually here in the background, but the other thing is that a lot of this kind of information is a kind of one-off when you create a record. It's not something that tends to be volatile or that you're constantly, at least from my experience anyway, constantly changing. So I tend to look at some of those things that are a bit tedious to work with initially as worth the effort at the time, because you don't have to do it every minute of every day for every record and every update, and it's the benefit you get out of it is probably worth it in many cases.
But it does end up making the forms ginormous.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
Unless if you're printing them off to fax or send by mail to somebody, they're gigantic. Yeah, sure.
Kate?
Yeah.
Another one that I thought of is, because you talked earlier about what fields we don't need anymore, and one the Inform Ontario Standards Committee ran into was the dates field. When I was doing some of the research for the hours field, for the modifications we just did, I found about half the members, well, the information referral members anyways, use the dates field, but mostly it was to say that they were open all year long. So there wasn't a lot of times where there was like, you know, closed for Christmas, things like that, though that was there as well, but also up in the hours field. So certainly if the hours field gets redesigned to incorporate all those exceptions, then the dates field might be one that the members just may not need to worry about anymore.
The other thing that I think will be really important in those kinds of discussions as well, Barb, it's Leslie, is to make sure that we get some input from the 211 group.
Yeah, definitely.
They're doing things at their end of the world that have implications for all our members who provide data to 211, and therefore we wouldn't want to be putting ourselves in a situation where we had to back scramble because of something 211 required. So it's part of the reason why I think it is very, very important that there be some solid input from those folks as we go along.
Yeah. Actually, the dates field 211 doesn't display it, because I checked that. That's one that they don't display.
They're changing a lot of what they're thinking about in those areas, and that's why I'm saying I think we need to keep up with, sort of in a formal way, we need to keep up with what their thinking is, so that whatever we do, at the very least, it isn't in conflict with what they want.
Right, absolutely. So how do we get any of that? Are they ready to present anything to folks yet?
Well, I tend to think that where we have to go with this is, rather than opt-in anyone who wants to show up to a session like we have today, there needs to be a couple of really directed sessions where we invite specific parties so that we can ensure that they are at the table to discuss their needs. And hopefully where we can ask people to consider those questions that I have in the presentation like this and the kinds of things we've talked about today, that they can have the time to think about those issues ahead of time. And that may mean giving some real background about, let's say, what would changes to the hours field really mean? What is it going to do to your forms? What is it going to do to the public? What, all the implications, so that people have some time to digest that and come forward to a session to actually make decisions about what the recommendations are going to be for these fields. I especially worry about the hours field, because in order to capture the complexity of information we're talking about in a broken down structured field, this is going to be really, really complicated, and certainly not something you could ever give to the public. They would faint. So
Yeah.
everybody needs to understand that. It's lovely to say, let's structure the field. Let's, make sure that that's great. But if you really think about what the form has to look like to do that, people may say, wow, that's really not worth it. Really not worth that. So, and maybe they won't. Maybe they'll think that's a great idea, or maybe you can say, okay, for the people crazy enough to want to structure it, they can structure it, and everyone else can keep it unstructured, and we have some way of coping with that when we change information between. So all of this background, in my opinion, it needs to be captured. We need to invite everyone that we know is a critical contributor to the table and not just wait for them to volunteer themselves to be there, but say, this directly impacts you. We need your opinion. You need to attend so that we can make an effective choice. This is the background that we have. These are the questions you should be asking yourself. Please be prepared before you attend to have an opinion on the matter. Right? That's my opinion of how you're going to proceed, because this is not something that you can just, we can't just make an arbitrary decision, and we certainly can't make a decision with just a small number of members expressing their opinion. We need to make sure that the critical stakeholders and the different kinds of members that we have all have an opportunity to understand how the changes would impact them and decide whether or not they want that or don't want that. And for people who don't want the change, how are we going to accommodate them? Because shoving the change down their necks is going to be a big problem and really not something that we want to do, and really outside of the mandate of what we said we would do. If someone is quite happy using a plain text hours field and is completely unprepared to use a very complex one, it's very difficult to justify coming along and forcing them into a very complex system when they do not want it. So we have to be very careful.
I tend to agree with you, Kate, that the complexity of what would have to happen to that field is hardly warranted. I don't believe the date field is a mandatory field. The hours field is.
No, it's not. Right.
And so in the hours field, because we particularly find there's a lot of seasonal businesses because, again, rural and vacation areas and so on. There's a lot of seasonal thing, but generally the hours change, or they are closed for parts of the year, or the hours change depending, but we include all that information in the hours field.
Yeah.
And so we do use the date field, but usually it's to say year-round, or September to June if they don't run summer programming or something, but that could easily be accommodated in the hours field.
In the hours field, yeah.
It could just be a matter of changing the standards to include what you used to include in the dates as part of the hours field and ditching the dates field. That's a simple change. That's not, you don't have to do any structural changes to make that happen. You just have to say, this is the new standard for the hours field. It includes information about seasonal operation, closure dates, and so on.
Right.
Yeah. That's kind of the
think
simplest one of all of them. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know. Are there any other fields that could be on the list of redundant? You said DD codes are still being used?
Yeah, that just shocked me.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what you would do with it. You can't really do anything with it in the software. It doesn't have a list of codes for you to use. You can't get statistics out of them. So I don't know.
Do they use those codes for their client tracker, though?
Well, if they did, it wouldn't. I don't know. I mean, I don't know why it's being used or what they do with it. It would have to be in some external system, I would guess, because CIOC does nothing with DD code.
Okay.
DD code is just a blob as far as we're concerned.
I think in many cases,
Interesting.
there's information in DD codes that's just legacy. People, I would be
Yeah,
very
legacy.
surprised
Yeah.
if newly created records had DD codes in them.
Client Health told me they were still using it.
Yeah, that's why I wondered if they were for the client tracker, because that's how I used to use them for Windsor.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I think we do need to pull the membership because honestly, if we have, say, one member or two members, they can create an extra field called extra DD code, and we can just ditch the DD code field.
I would totally agree with that. We don't find it necessary, but again, it's still in a lot of the records because we haven't gotten rid of it. It's just like
Legacy.
I think what Leslie said, a legacy. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's certainly not being used for anything for our purposes here.
But if we do have the meeting that I'm talking about, what I can do relatively easily is determine which fields are being used and which databases. So I can say, and even how often they're updated, frankly, because we have history. So it is possible to get some metrics and say, you know, this field is being used in this many databases by this many records, and it changes with this frequency. I can actually get those kind of metrics out, which may help to inform the group. So for instance, if you do have that DD code field and you never change it, I would be able to tell that. I would be able to go into your database, look in your history table, and see that you never changed that information, which tells us something about how useful it is.
Well, that means you've classified it and you've moved on.
Yeah, potentially, but I think but if it's never even being put in for new records.
Right, that makes a difference, yeah.
Right.
That's the key.
Yeah.
If it's not being put in.
See, if it was being put in for new records, it would appear in the history field, right?
Okay.
So it really does tell you something, that history metric, because if it was, say, take funding, where you're just going to put it in the new record and you probably never update it again, it's still going to appear in your history because for every new record you create, you're going to be adding it.
Right.
Versus a field that you're not really using anymore, you're not going to be doing that data entry on new records, so it's not going to appear in your history field.
Interesting. Any other fields that come to mind, folks? And I realize most of these now are optional fields, but there was originally 100 and some fields in the original data schema.
There's about 100. We have about 150 official fields, and each of those may have multiple parts. So if you take something like contact 1, it has many, many parts to it, right? So we consider all of those different parts one field, contact 1. And we've got about 150. And then you can have as many extra fields as you want. So in some databases, people might have 170 or more fields.
Okay. So should we now flip the other way? Is there anything missing? I mean, I realize we can make an extra field, but is there actually, like, Ward that was just created this last year or so?
Oh, Ward's been around for a while.
Well, okay, longer than that. But
yeah.
Are there any other elements that are missing? I mean, certainly when Inform Ontario worked on the style guide, we went through the standards.
I think there are some fields that are gaining popularity in that it used to be just 1 or 2 members that use it, and they're starting to be used by more. And I think it's worth noting that, because then it comes up as, at what point should it be a standard? You know, if 70% of members are using it. Fields like that would be the Ward field is getting used more and more. The bus route field is getting used more and more. There's a transportation field, which is getting used more and more.
I'm sorry, transportation?
Yeah.
And how is that different from bus route?
No, it's about providing transportation. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it's not about public transit. It's about, does the service provide transportation to its clients?
That kind of service. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So those kinds of fields are gaining popularity, in that more members are starting to keep information in those. The child care fields are starting to get used more for those that want to keep more detail about the child care programs in terms of the kinds of services and that are provided, like is it full-time care, is it full-day care, etc. So I think it's worth acknowledging that they're there, and in particular, let's say that someone is capturing child care information in the child, how do we transfer that information to 211ontario.ca such that the person doesn't have to double enter that information in the description?
Right.
Right? So we can deal with that. So let's say we have in the software a way of transforming CIOC information into 211ontario.ca information. And it is possible for us to say, gather up all that child care information and dump it into the description, such that the poor people who are entering the child care information don't have to double enter it once in the child care field and then enter it again in the description, right? Mm-hmm. So those kinds of things need to be identified. In order to do that, you sort of have to acknowledge that those fields are there and that people want to use them, and say, you know, it's completely fine if people don't want to have that be a standard in that they don't want it to go into the provincial portal as its own field. But if we acknowledge that people want to use those fields, how can we roll that information up into the official field so that when they do go out to 211ontario.ca, people aren't having to double enter the information. We can just roll it up and stick it into the description field or wherever it belongs, such that we're not requiring double data entry.
Right.
Anyway, I don't know if it'll be up to the course to take on how we're going to proceed with this. You know, whether there is going to be kind of a stakeholder meeting, you know, how the documentation should be prepared ahead of time so people know what to review, what is going to be discussed at each meeting, whether you have a meeting specifically on particular data elements, like today we're having a meeting where we're discussing hours and dates and making a decision on that, or today we're discussing, you know, hours, dates, and areas served, so that people have an agenda, they have a background about, you know, what the pros and cons are, what the suggested changes are. They have time to think about it, and then everyone can come together, discuss, and make decisions with the key stakeholders all in attendance, which you can really only do by individually inviting them.
Makes sense.
Okay, I have a question. Sorry, my screen went blank as I'm facing the phone. Helen has a question or a comment here. She had a question about adding Facebook and Twitter contact information. They put it in the resources, but she's asking about adding her own field. So I hadn't gotten my last slide. Thanks, Helen. That's in my last slide. So I'm sorry, I didn't even do my last slide. I had a moment there. I didn't even get to what new fields might be considered.
Ah.
Wow. Good. So yay, thank you to Helen for that reminder. These are the ones that we've already had requests for, okay? So these need to be considered as new fields. We now have at the bottom of the feedback form, you can optionally turn on data use authorization so that the person submitting the feedback can say whether or not they're authorizing use of the information and for what purposes. But we don't give you anywhere in the record to store that information. So they can provide it to you, but you have nowhere to store it. So what use is that? So the idea here is that when people do submit that data use information, that we actually give you somewhere to store it, so you have a record of when the authorization was received, what they authorized, and so on. The next one is our on-demand extra fields are great. Knowing I'm never going to have to add another new text field again because people can just make their own is wonderful. But we need to do the same thing for drop-downs, checklists, memo fields, pretty much anything like that, so that we no longer have to people no longer have to submit an enhancement request. Say if they need a new checklist field for a special project, they could just make their own. Name it whatever they need to name it, and they can have as many as they want. So the idea here is really to give a lot of control and customization power to the members to be able to create new fields as they require them, and frankly, when they don't need that field anymore, to get rid of it. The next is the ability to set a reminder in a record that's different from the update schedule. So some reason why you need to do something with the record, contact someone, whatever the case may be, which is different from having to come back to the record to do a full update. So the idea being that you would maybe see an alert in your main menu if there were reminders that had come up that you hadn't dismissed. Pretty simple concept, really.
Yeah, like this agency's moving next month.
Week. Yeah.
Yeah, and it could be anything. The idea is any kind of reason why you need that record brought to your attention, other than the normal update schedule. And
I think that would be fabulous.
Yeah, the next is exactly what Helen was talking about, links to social networking pages. Woohoo, yes, I had thought of that. Really, simple, easy links to Twitter, Facebook, whatever you would like. I did want to remind everyone, you can create fields for these now. So if you want to create an extra website field called extra www Facebook, in which you store links to their Facebook pages, or extra www Twitter, in which you store links to their Twitter feeds, you can do that now. So that certainly is what I would recommend if you want to start keeping that information, is that you create a Facebook field, you create a Twitter field, and allow people to enter that information if you want. But in the long run, it would be much nicer to just be able to have the little Facebook icon, the little Twitter icon added to the record, so that, if they filled out a Facebook field or a Twitter feed field or whatever, that it would put those lovely little links that everyone is so accustomed to seeing on websites now. Okay? All right, glad I met your question, Helen. Thank you for the reminder. I would have completely missed that slide if you hadn't sort of brought that to my attention. So yes, we had thought of that. So definitely that's on the list. All right, so there actually are new things. To answer your question, Barb, yes, there's new things that we know about that people need, but we do hope that having all these extra fields is going to go a long way towards people being able to make those decisions on the fly as they need it, and not really be dependent on CIOC to think ahead of what fields are required, but basically give them the power to create a space for the information as it's needed. And it's more likely to come up with special projects. I think for the most part, the basic INR work, other than things like, the new social networking stuff, that for the most part, you guys already keep a lot of information about these agencies. And it's really when you start dealing with other kinds of services where they have other kinds of needs that you start running into needing new fields, because the information they require is different from your basic INR needs.
So I'm just curious, what happens though if by using the extra fields, Leslie has extra field 10 as bus route and Diane has extra field 9 as bus route, and they want to merge their data?
Well, then you should.
Are there not issues along the way there?
Well, so first of all, there's a bus routes field.
Yeah, well, I just have to think of one.
Let's just say theoretically, let's say there wasn't a bus routes field. You should be naming your field extra bus routes. And if you both name it extra bus route, then it will share. So the new extra field features in the software allow you to name the extra field something specific. So there's no more extra A, extra B, extra C. No, done. Now it's extra, and then you give it whatever name you want it to be. So it's not going to be the case of I use extra B for this and you use extra B for something else entirely. I'm not going to make an extra B. I'm going to make an extra long-term care bed. And if you make an extra long-term care bed, then when we data share with each other, my extra long-term care beds information goes into your extra long-term care bed information.
So then it just becomes an internal thing of making sure the fields have the same name.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Is that the label name or is that the
No, the actual
down
field
deeper?
name.
down deeper.
Yeah. When you set up the extra field, you give it a field name behind the scenes. The label that you display can be different between
anything
the
you want, yeah.
just like any other field.
Okay. Okay, because I know that was an issue. It has been an issue, right, where with merges?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
but that's part of why we did the extra field change is having them A, B, C, D, E, F, G is totally useless. It tells you nothing about what gets kept in those fields. And by giving them a real label that means something, that shouldn't be an issue anymore.
Right. Good. Okay.
It also lets you have more than 26.
Yeah, you can have as many extra fields as you want. I mean, literally, if you wanted 100 extra fields, you could create 100 of them.
Okay, and then it solves the other problems. Yeah.
Well, and the
Okay,
thing is,
good.
in the end, even if you start out with having named them differently, and then you realize you'd like to share data and you want them, you can go back and name them the same, right? You can change the field name.
Absolutely.
Right. Field name, and then so really your problem is resolved just by harmonizing what you've called them, which is pretty simple.
Yep.
Good.
So that's really no longer an issue. We've solved that problem. Yippee.
Good. Any other questions or comments, folks? Sorry, I was supposed to be moderating this. Hi, folks. Barb. Didn't get to say that at the beginning. Any other questions or comments or other field issues?
This is maybe stepping back a little bit, but some of these things I hadn't thought about. I was wondering about the established field, how necessary people find that
There's another one.
And the resources field too.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a couple of things like that. I'm sort of thinking through the fields, and like you said, Kate, there's a lot of them. So it's like, okay, what could we actually dispense with? You know, hadn't really ever thought about the cost savings. You know, you think about the work savings, but the cost savings of maintaining extra fields I hadn't really considered before. So, do others use the established field? I know we asked for the information, but I'm not sure that we ever actually use that information.
Yeah, we use it, but we've never actually been asked for it.
No, we haven't.
In Hamilton, we keep it very sporadically if somebody gives us the information, but if it's missing from a suggested new record, we don't turn around and go back to the person and say, we can't process this until you tell us when you were established.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a lot of times they can't tell you. It's like, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, something like that.
Well,
exactly.
Quite frankly, if somebody needed information about when an organization was established,
they can contact them.
I was going to say, you just get in touch with the organization.
Some organizations might want to have it as a point of pride.
But then they could have it in the description if they really care.
But my point was to be a built-in one. Maybe it needs to be an extra field. Right, where it's extra information is not a...
Resources is used. I know that lots of people do use resources.
But I think they all use it differently, though.
They use it differently, yeah. Most people, it'll be an internal, I think officially, in fact, it should be an internal resources. So what internal resources you have for that organization, that it's not a public-facing field, officially speaking. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's one of those people have used in many different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any others, Diane, that you can see?
I don't know. Those sort of came to mind. I know that
there's... like it's a can of worms exercise. You start looking at them saying, oh, heck, we'll get rid of 50% of them.
Well, you know, anything that isn't mandatory, again, it could be up to the individual member to say, I don't use this anymore. I'm going to stop keeping this information and give myself a break because nobody's requiring it of me. I don't keep it consistently. Why am I keeping it? And that's okay.
And I know the meetings field is one that creates a lot of, and I don't know that it's just what kind of information goes in the meetings field. I know that there's a lot of discussion going on around that specifically, and so it's probably something that needs.
That one is not a required field, but the standards committee did do a style guide page for it a couple months ago. Yeah, because 2-in-1s talked about making that mandatory.
Was that not just a draft though?
Yeah,
or is that
but
official?
Not quite official yet, but yeah, it will be.
It will be?
It would be
Okay.
nice to incorporate a calendar into the meetings field.
Oh, cool.
What I'm envisioning is, you check off, okay, a date, here's when their meeting is, what meeting it is, what location. It just links to the record. And then somewhere in the future we see a calendar and we can click on a day and go, okay, all these groups are meeting today.
Yeah. The issue with that again is it's an awesome idea. Are you prepared for the more complicated forms that are behind that?
Yeah, and no.
No.
No, too much work. But it would be nice.
Yeah. I'm sorry, can we go back to meetings, Diane? Was there anything in particular, except the fact that
No,
people
I
weren't sure how
knew
to
that.
use it?
Yeah, I knew the draft had happened, but I didn't know whether that was official yet. So, we've been sort of, okay, where are we going with this? And so, if you're considering it quasi-official, then
Yeah, quasi-official. As soon as I got everything all reorganized, yeah. We're going to come out with a 2011 edition, just
And
to
how
clean
soon
it all
is
up,
that?
everybody. Hopefully by May or June, by symposium.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because there really isn't that many changes.
That's why it's so important to make sure that we have all the stakeholders at this discussion, because we may be completely unaware of some of the plans if we don't make sure that everyone who needs to have a voice is in attendance.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I agree with you there, Kate. I've actually been surprised with these discussions that you've been having because they're all very pertinent, and I've learned an enormous amount just about what we already have by attending these, and I'm disappointed, I think, that how few are attending because this is an invaluable process as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. So on that topic, we've posted most of the videos at this point. It's on the same page as the PowerPoint. So I do welcome you to point out to your peers that those are available and that they may gain a lot of insight by reviewing those materials, even if they weren't able to attend the session.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone thought about doing away the collected by and collected date fields versus the created dates that are set automatically? I know we all use them, but is it just a matter of because it's so easy to click those buttons on when you're making a record?
I think once upon a time, people
useful
literally collected it on a form. And so the person who did the data entry was different than the person who collected the information.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's true anymore.
Yeah, because some of that could be done automatically, right? As soon as you save the record, it says, Jennifer did it.
Yeah, and we do that already with the created. Yeah, the software already does that. So I completely agree, Jennifer. I don't think that the time when collected by and collected date mattered exists anymore, because the process that people use in these distant past for collecting information was completely different from what people do today.
Yeah, I would agree. Collected by and collected date are stupid.
Yeah, I would agree too.
Yeah.
Wow, we came to a consensus.
Wow.
Go for it.
I've got like 6 down already to look at,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of it. We can get rid of them now out of our view, and we'll soon find out if we miss them.
Yeah. What about the source?
Figure out whether or not we want to keep them is to get rid of them and
we need source info.
For them.
Yeah. Well, is source though the one, Kate, you were talking about with the data use authorization? Would that go into like the source? So if I say I updated a record, my name would go into the source field automatically?
I would say data use authorization actually needs to be its own field, and that with its own history. So you could see data use authorization over time. I expect it would end up capturing who provided the authorization, but it should be doing that automatically, because if that's submitted by the public, or you're talking to the person over the phone and you're getting their name, then
then that's the source.
That would be captured. And I think the source of the data and the authorization are, I don't want to line them up too closely because it's not necessarily the case. And the source is whoever the last source was Whereas the data use authorization, I think you want to have the history of, when and by whom authorization was provided.
Right, right. So they can go back and say, well, who's Joe Blow? He doesn't work here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Well, and sometimes your source can be for something other than they may be able to give you an updated, ED name, but they can't authorize. In other words, it can be two different processes.
Yeah.
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 Although I must say the whole business of data use authorization is a pain in the neck. Makes one wish we never heard of it. Because
hey, you blame me for that.
Yeah.
People are saying things, but they don't actually mean it when you go back to them and say, I noticed you clicked that we're not allowed to use this information for anything much at all, and sort of probe a little bit, and it turns out that they actually weren't. They
didn't
clear
mean that.
what they were choosing.
Yeah.
But it does provide you with protection having the authorization at the same time. So it's a challenge. Like we got it. Yeah. It's important. It has importance. Even to CIOC. We got an unpleasant email the other day with somebody who was mad that his email was on someone's site. And I'm thinking, I didn't give you your email to be posted on the site. If you don't want it there, you need to ask for it to be taken down. But in those kinds of cases where you have someone really angry about their listing being public, like, why is my email on the internet? It's nice to know that they submitted a form saying, I authorize this information to be used. Yeah. And you can say, well, you said we could post it. We're happy to take it down, but you can't yell at us for posting the information that you said we could post, right? Yeah. So, it still has, I think it has a role.
That's happened with us a little bit, especially for people who are not watching out for autofill and end up posting, their home email instead of their work email because they didn't notice that autofill.
Yeah, that's why we turned autofill off on most of our forms because it was a real problem.
But their own way that they were dealing with forms has been, and then they get to you and say, what are you doing with my home email? And we're thinking, well, we didn't invent it out of the air.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, it's funny.
So, Barb, are you?
Yes, ma'am.
Are you feeling that you'll take back to the task force, I guess, some kind of? I guess the task force needs to come up with some kind of plan for how we will hold some more official decision-making meetings around some of these changes. I think we've come up with a lot of ideas, and I think we want to get them on paper before we have a decision-making meeting, which is why a session like this is useful to do some brainstorming ahead of time. But you want people to be able to review the information before the discussion and decision-making rather than presenting it fresh to them when they haven't had time to think about, are we really using this in our database? What are we using it for? You want people to have time ahead of time to think about those things, I think.
Okay, so let me ask you this, because actually I was asked this earlier today too, and so I'll ask it in two parts then. For this particular topic, what would be like the last drop dead date for feedback? Right,
so this we've got on our current development schedule, we have 2 releases beyond the one we're working on now, at least 2 more releases. So any of the changes could target either one. The first one is, I can't remember if it's November, but it's sort of mid to late fall, and the second one would be in the spring, and there could be one in the middle. So any of the changes we talk about could hit any one of those, so it's not like if we don't make our decision tomorrow, we're in big trouble. But at the same time, you want to have a sense of the changes at the same time that we make other decisions about where the project funds are going to be directed.
Funds are going. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So it should really try and work on the same kind of timeline, especially any kind of significant change. So a minor change like, let's get rid of this field, no one really needs it, that decision can be made any time because that is really a almost no-cost decision to get rid of something. versus if you want to completely restructure a field, like restructure the phone field, that's a relatively significant change. So we need to know and plan for it in terms of budget. We also need to plan in enough time to notify members to get any concerns that they have and have a plan for dealing with those concerns.
Okay. Leslie, sounds like a workshop to me, eh?
Oh,
what do you think?
She's exited the room, but yeah.
Oh, has she? Oh, darn, I'll email her. Okay, so that's that one. So
I don't think I think it's going to be a process that might take a little time. I think you also might want to deal with it in small chunks, like pick particular topics and review those topics. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a whole day session, which is a huge commitment for people.
Yeah. Okay, and then I was asked earlier before you came on, if people have additional feedback for any of the sessions, what would be your deadline for that? End of March is what I said? Because you're going to start to tabulate all the enhancement pieces in April.
Yeah, I would say, you know, by early April, we need to have received any feedback on the past sessions. At the same time, there is truly no deadline to feedback for CIOC. So if you have feedback after that time, you may still provide it. There is no, you know, the CIOC is in an ongoing development process, so there is always room for feedback. I don't want people to think they can't give it just because a date has passed. At the same time, if you don't give your input by the time we do our prioritizing sessions, your ideas may not get prioritized simply because they aren't there in time for us to put out to the membership. So in a way, there is no deadline, but at the same time, if you really have a high priority issue, you need to let us know before we do the priority exercise.
Right.
Which would mean you need to let us know by early April.
Yeah. Good. Any other questions or comments, folks? No? Good session.
Yeah.
A lot of good stuff there. Things to think about.
Yeah. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it. And yeah, I'll hopefully see some of you on Monday.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Great.
Kate.
Thank you so very much, folks. Have a good weekend.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.